In ancient times, streets became deserted within 30 to 40 minutes after sunset, and thus there existed a brief window of time for lighting Hanukkah candles. Given the very different contemporary reality, might Chazal not have prescribed a later time were they alive today?
There are, in fact, a number of points to clarify with regards to this question. If we discuss the possibility of a different window of time with regards to lighting Ner Hanukkah, this could refer to 3 points or 3 aspects of this window. It could refer to the beginning of the time, the opening of that window, the end of that time, the closing of that window, and also it could refer to the length of that time. That is to say, for how long that window of opportunity is open. For how long may one light Hanukkah candles. Let us take the first point. It is true that in ancient times, and not just very ancient times, this was probably true till even just a few centuries and perhaps even a few generations ago in certain parts of the world, it is entirely true that the streets emptied out shortly after sunset. People would be at their work till sunset, till a bit before that time. They would close their shops, come in from the fields. They would make their way home. On the way, they might stop by the shops that were about to close and buy something they needed for their homes, for dinner. The Talmud mentions buying firewood at that time, at the end of the day. And they would make their way home. That is entirely true. And therefore it's clear why that window of opportunity for lighting Hanukkah candles was brief. And a person could say, well, with regards to the beginning of the time, it's certainly not true that people end their day when the sun sets nowadays because of artificial lighting and many other factors. And therefore, perhaps they would have set the time to be closer to the time that people tend to get home. Now, when do people tend to get home nowadays? Some people get home at 5 p.m., some at 6, some at 7, some at 8, some even later perhaps, depending on various countries, cultures, occupations, etc. So what time exactly could Chazal, if they were alive today, what would they have said? 5 p.m., 6 p.m., 7, 8, 9, who can say? I really do not know, frankly. That's one point. Another point to mention is that the Torah does not work according to the clock hands that we see on our clock faces nowadays. The Torah works in terms of the real world, that is to say night and day, astronomical events, sunrise, sunset, Hasot Hayom, the middle of the day, Hasot Halayla, the middle of the night, dawn, first light in the east, which is called Alot HaShahar, Hanes Hama, which is sunrise, and other astronomical and observable events, which essentially define the day and the night, and the points at which one blends in with the other or becomes the other. So I do not really think that it is reasonable to suggest that Chazal, were they with us today, would have spoken in terms of the clock, 6 p.m., 7 p.m., 8 p.m., knowing full well, by the way, as we all do, that this is not a one-size-fits-all scenario. Different people have different schedules, and you really could not find a time that works for everybody. Now, some might suggest that Chazal perhaps would have said you should light at nightfall, when the night begins, which is a little bit after the setting of the sun. That is possibly true, again, as a speculative suggestion, but you really would not be solving the central issue that many people would raise, namely that most people, or many people, are not home at that time. If people are not home, shall we say in Israel, when the sun sets at the time around Hanukkah time, 4:35, 4:40 in the afternoon, then people are also not going to be home at 5 p.m., generally speaking. So again, you would have the question of what time to fix as the correct time to begin the lighting of candles. Others, on the other hand, might suggest, well, perhaps Hazal could have said, light candles 2 or 3 hours after nightfall. That's also hypothetically possible. But to that, some people might respond that you have a different kind of problem in that case. Many children might be asleep already. Maybe some older people, perhaps very old people, wish to retire very early, and that would also be too late for them, would be inconvenient. So again, we see that there is no one time, a universal time that could have been established by Hazal that would have been convenient and appropriate and practicable for all people, or even for perhaps most people. So let us now turn to the opposite end of the scale, the end of the time for lighting Nerot Hanukkah. With regards to this, there is, I believe, universal agreement today that that parameter has certainly changed, not just in the real world, but also halachically. In other words, seeing that it is certainly the case in almost all communities, whether one lives downtown in some major urban center or in other types of communities, it is certainly not the case that the streets empty out within 30 to 40 minutes after sunset. Again, due to artificial lighting, people's work schedules, and many other considerations. And therefore, one can certainly light Hanukkah candles till much later at night. For now, let us assume that a person did not or could not light at sunset. Can a person light nowadays? Let's say they get home at 7 p.m., 8 p.m., 9 p.m. The answer is most definitely yes. The wording of Hazal was Misha Tishka Hama, from the setting of the sun, immediately following the setting of the sun, Ad Shetichla Rechel Minashuk, until the streets empty out. And it is a fact that the emptying out of the streets nowadays is much later than 30 or 40 minutes after sunset. In some communities it might be 2 hours after that point in time, after sunset. In others it might be 3 or 4 hours. In certain urban locations it might be almost all night, quite literally. The story is told of Velvumi Brisk, the Brisker Rov, who used to live in Geula, in the Geula neighborhood in Yerushalayim. We're talking about the 40s, the 50s, Leminyanam, and he was asked this question: when is the Zman, the time of Ad Shetichla Rechel Min Hashuk today? When is the end of the Zman for lighting Hanukkah candles nowadays? And he thought for a moment and he responded with a question. He said, when does the last showing of the movies in the Edison cinema get out in the evening? At that time there was a cinema called the Edison, which was not very far from where he lived, in Geula, and he asked, when is the last showing of movies at that time? And he was told people get out from that late showing around 11:30. So he said that is Ad Shetichla Rechel Min Hashuk. And one understands exactly why, because in Yerushalayim of that time, that was the latest you would find people out and about. That was also the time when the latest buses would be running and taking people home. In other words, by midnight, essentially, everything was shut and the streets would be emptying out. So, briefly, this time, Ad Shetichla Rechel Min Hashuk, the time of the emptying out of the streets, the time when people will no longer be out and about to see the candle that you light, that time has obviously changed, and also today is changing, and it varies from location to location, from community to community, from town to city, rural areas, small villages, small yishuvim, etc., etc. So no one universal time can be fixed for this end of the Zman either. Just as it was impossible to fix one universal time that fit all people and all situations with regards to the beginning of the time. But clearly it is much later than it used to be, sometimes much later by many, many hours. So, halakha ma'aseh, if a person or a family is in a situation where, because of their obligations, their schedules, what have you, they can light Hanukkah candles not at sunset and not shortly after sunset, but only 2, 3, or 4 hours after that time. In almost all places nowadays, there will still be people about to see that candle that you light, and therefore you can still light candles with a bracha at that time, and you are performing the mitzvah. No question about that. It was already recognized by the Tosafot and other Rishonim many, many centuries ago that in different generations, in different circumstances, these times will of needs change. This type of question already arose 9 centuries ago, for example, at the time of the Tosafot. In Masechet Shabbat, Daf Kaf Aleph Amud Beth 21b, Tosafot di lam adlik madlik. I quote, L'Rabbeinu Yitzhak nir'eh da'ata, nowadays, in their time, en lahush matay adlik. It is not crucial when you light the candles. Da'anu en lanu hekera ela livnei abayit, because it is only after all the people in our own homes who see the candles. Sharei madlikim bi bifnim, because we light inside. The Tosafot are, of course, describing a situation in which the Jews, for reasons of anti-Semitism and quite literally pikuach nefesh, not risking life unnecessarily, they lit the candles inside in a place where only they themselves could see the candles, and therefore Rabbeinu Yitzhak Bar Tosafot says, practically it doesn't matter nowadays when we light. The main thing is that we see it. We light it and we see it because we are the only people who do get to see it. Now, Baruch Hashem, today there are very few and almost no places in the world where a Jew cannot light his Hanukkah candles freely without fear of endangering himself, of reprisal, or what have you. So we're in a different situation, but the reason for invoking something along the lines that Rabbeinu Yitzhak Bar Tosafot states, that today we can be much more flexible regarding the time, this is very true and very relevant to our situation. So again, people who are able to light only later in the evening, but at a time when the people will see the candle, whether they're lighting outside their home or from a window that faces the street or what have you, that is when they're able to, that is when they should light the candle. And they are being mekayem the miswah, they are fulfilling this miswah by so doing. And now we turn to the third point, namely the span of time during which it is possible to light Hanukkah candles. We spoke about the beginning of the time, of the window of opportunity, the end of that period when the streets have emptied out completely. Nowadays is certainly much later than it was, and can be nowadays very much later. In some places it might well be the wee hours of the morning, in other places perhaps midnight, in other places 10 p.m. It all depends. It follows that the span of time during which one may light the Hanukkah candles is much longer than it was in the time of Hazal. Another question that arises, therefore, from this fact is the following. Are we required to have our candles last that entire period? This question has been asked before. I myself have been asked this question more than once, because the Talmud states that one has to have the candles alight for the entire period that they were discussing, namely a period of approximately 30 or 40 minutes. Nowadays, this would mean many hours. So I have responded to this question in the past in the following manner. It is unreasonable, so it seems to me, to claim that we must have candles that last as many as 5, 6, 7, 8 or more hours. That would be in many ways impracticable, and it could also become quite expensive. And that does not seem at all reasonable to suggest that we are required to do so, that that would be a chova. However, to suggest that because there are many people out and about much later, and therefore there'll be many other opportunities for different people to see the candles, beyond that brief window of opportunity that existed in ancient times, it does make some sense as a kind of hidur, as a humrah, as something which is perhaps desirable but not an obligation, to have candles that last longer than 30, 40 minutes or even longer than an hour. How long? I would say maybe 2-3 hours at the most. More than that, I think, would certainly be well beyond the call of duty. In conclusion, our general approach to living according to the Torah and according to Halakha has to be based on the clear understanding that what Hazal decreed and established is binding. It is only in very particular types of situations with regards to specific types of halachot and circumstances that we should look for a different approach or make some adjustment or modification to the clear and unequivocal directions and decrees of Chazal. This is not usually the case. In other words, many of those halachot, many of the types of situations in which we see some people today trying to cut corners or develop new approaches are not based on true need, on cogent argument, on completely different facts and realities, but rather on certain predilections and preferences that people have, very often based on foreign ideologies being influenced by non-Torah thinking, and those are never the correct reason for making a change to halakha. Where halakha can be modified, and in fact must be modified, are those places where Hazal themselves, were they here with us today, would have told us, in this situation, the halakha should be different from what we expressed at that time, and for these very specific reasons. When we follow that mode of thinking and that approach, we are on safe ground.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.